Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Clone Troopers, pride of the Republic, bane of the Jedi, and all around one of the best mass-produced soldiers in galactic history. They were precisely engineered to be superior to the average man, both physically and mentally. Never tired, never frightened. Yet they still shared a lot of the same characteristics that we had. They had the same hormones and adrenaline that temporarily lets us become superhuman, the motivation and independent thought that makes us dangerous and unpredictable adversaries, the intelligence that allows us to approach a problem from an infinite amount of ways. Or that's at least how the Kaminoan scumbags sold the clones to the Jedi in all their brochures and marketing material. The truth and what actually happened to the clone troopers was a little bit different. As we all know, the clones were created from the DNA of Jango Fett, a bounty hunter that was at the top of his game. He was not only physically talented, he was also intelligent, disciplined, and ruthless, perhaps even a borderline psychopath. That last trait apparently helps a lot when it comes to bounty hunting. Think about it. He obviously has some delusions of grandeur. Not only did he agree to allow the Kaminoans to clone millions of copies of himself, he even made them clone one unaltered version of himself that he can raise as his own son. That is an extremely narcissistic thing to do. Fett is also known for lying about his Mandalorian heritage. Ask anyone on Mandalore and they'll say he's just some crook who stole a suit of armor, not a real Mandalorian. And of course, when he's hunting, things like emotions and feelings never really distract him. He's essentially a high-functioning psychopath. And if you think about it in that way, well, it probably wasn't a good idea to create hundreds of thousands of copies of him. But then again, I have it on good authority that the majority of those long-necked talking fish heads are psychopaths, having genocided groups of their own people with less desirable genetic traits in order to survive the climate disaster which submerged their planet many years ago. Anyway, psychopath or not, usually personality disorders are caused by both genetic and environmental factors. So it doesn't necessarily mean that clones will all become psychopaths. Although if you are living in an environment designed by psychopaths, which actually looks like an Apple store, well, you might just be out of luck. Nah, I'm just joking. Most clones are actually pretty awesome people and not psychopaths. And part of that was how the Kaminoans adjusted the Fett DNA. To start off, they altered the clones so they would be more docile and willing to follow orders. They are less independent but at the same time capable creative thinkers and problem solvers. Any hyper-aggressive and volatile tendencies were also muted and made more controllable. One other important thing that really played a huge part in their personalities was their age. You see, in order to meet the deadline for Palpatine's grand old Sith Order reawakening party, the Kaminoan cloners had to speed up the aging of the clones by 2 times, which means by the time they were 9, they actually had the physical bodies of an 18-year-old. But while the clones physically and hormonally went through the developmental stages to adulthood, their minds were still that of a 9-year-old when they were first deployed. Which is actually really messed up, but before we talk more about that, let's look at their 9 years on Kamino and their training. Well, to start off, from the time they were born, their lives were carefully structured and scheduled. Each day was regimented in a way to maximize efficiency. They attended classes and training sessions to give themselves all the skills necessary to become a soldier. Being isolated from the rest of the galaxy, the Kaminoan cloners had control of all information that arrived onto the planet. In that way, for better or worse, they had no distractions from the outside world like normal kids. Their future was carefully laid out for them. What was expected of them and what they expected was all clearly stated. Now, obviously, for most of us, a life like that wouldn't be all that easy to live. But that's because we know what's out there in the world, all those opportunities and possibilities that we could have. Like KOTOR 3 or a standalone Obi-Wan Kenobi movie. Most of them were happy and they had fun in their classes and training. The one goal in their life, the one thing that their 9 years of training and conditioning pounded into them was the desire to become the best soldier possible and to protect the Republic, despite the fact that none of them were even citizens. So on the eve of the Battle of Geonosis, what we have are a group of extremely eager humans with the physical bodies of an 18-year-old and the training and skills of an elite soldier and the naivete and innocence of a 9-year-old. So let's think about this for a moment. How many 9-year-olds do you know? How many of those 9-year-olds are capable of formal operations or the capacity for more advanced abstract thought? How many of those 9-year-olds are much more likely to blindly follow something that entices them with rewards? It's widely accepted that it's only until our teen years that we begin rejecting ideas, developing independent thoughts, and become hard to control. But at 9 years old, a child is still compliant and consequently perfect for cannon fodder. Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, leader of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide, said the following about preteen soldiers. They have no sense of fear, and when indoctrinated young enough, their capacity for loyalty and for barbarism exceeds that of adults. And that's why on Geonosis, as Republic forces began advancing on Separatist forces, the clone troopers fearlessly engaged the enemy on open ground without any cover. A prospect I imagine was terrifying enough during the age of bow and arrows, let alone during a time when lasers, missiles, and tanks were commonplace on the battlefield. Despite the Jedi General's idiotic battlefield strategy of carrying out an infantry assault on a heavily fortified position over a huge amount of flat ground with no cover, the clone troopers did their job and were able to win the day. But the consequences of the battle was immediately felt afterwards. Although official casualty numbers were censored by Disney for public morale reasons, it's estimated in legends that tens of thousands of clones died, along with at least 5,000 Republic commandos. The clone commandos were amongst the many specialized units that were deployed as regular infantry and slaughtered in open space, where their special training and equipment gave them no advantages. Compared to the average clone, the clone commandos were more aggressive and independent. This means they were amongst the first clones to begin questioning the capabilities of their Jedi leaders. Other clones suffered terrible wounds or saw their entire squads get wiped out. This trial by fire matured them in a way that flash training and simulations never could. The battle also killed off some of the more eager clones that were willing to run headfirst into blaster fire. The months that followed would continue to test these clones. With their numbers severely depleted after Geonosis, the clones found themselves heavily outnumbered by the Separatist droid army, and constantly on the front lines without respite. Although casualty rates dropped and the Jedi became better tacticians, there were already problems cropping up amongst the clone ranks. During the Battle of Christophsis, Clone Sergeant Slick was caught feeding information to Separatist leader Asajj Ventress. Sergeant Slick believed that the Jedi were treating the clones like slaves. He wanted freedom and betrayed his brothers for money and the promise of a new life away from the GAR. Now, most of you remember the story from the Clone Wars series, but I consider that pro-Republic propaganda, created by a known supporter of the Republic, Dave Filoni. Now, if we really look at Slick's actions in an objective way, as reprehensible as they may be, he had a point. The clones were slaves. They had no choice in whether they wanted to fight or not. The clones might have had the mental development of a 9-year-old, but most of them were smart enough to see that they had gotten a raw deal. I wouldn't be surprised if more clones didn't share the same beliefs as Slick, especially if we consider that not all Jedi generals were as compassionate and caring as Anakin and Obi-Wan. Some Jedi generals outright hated their troops. Some considered them subhuman. On top of that, the Jedi Code usually frowned on emotional attachment, which meant that most Jedi actively tried to distance themselves away from their soldiers. And many clones began realizing just how terrible their situation was. They were slaves fighting for a republic that they weren't even citizens of. They weren't soldiers fighting for the republic, but property of the GAR. Morale dropped even lower as rumors came out about what was happening to injured clones. While some clones were rehabilitated, others deemed no longer capable of combat were just terminated. Legends say that termination of unworthy clones was something that the Kaminoans did all the time, which is why clones naturally hated and feared the fish heads. As the clones began deploying more on populated worlds where they were exposed to what life was like outside of the army, they began developing in their own ways. They found hobbies, attachments to material goods, addictions, and pleasures. It was easy to be a clone trooper when that was the only life they knew. But now that the clones had seen what else was out there, experienced these worldly pleasures, things started to crack. I mean, gene sampling and conditioning can only suppress human urges for so long. You have clones like Cut Lawquane, who went AWOL, settled down with a nice Twi'lek girl, and started his own family. Lawquane was discovered by Captain Rex, who in his early years exemplified the qualities of the perfectly loyal clone trooper. But even Rex understood why Cut did what he did, and didn't report him. This act of kindness for his fellow brother and defiance against protocol was the first step that Rex would take to freeing himself. As the war continued, all these factors that we mentioned began affecting the clones more and more. We began seeing distinct personalities emerge, especially amongst the more elite ARC troopers and commando units. Clones started decorating their armor, changing their appearance, finding independence and individuality in an army of genetic copies. Along with that individualism developed sarcasm, cynicism, and open rebellion, traits we usually associate with teenagers. Which actually makes sense. 3 years into the Clone Wars, the clone troopers were now teenagers. The clones that survived up till this time were very different from the shinies who marched into Geonosis. They were still very competent soldiers, but they were a lot more cautious than they used to be. The 501st functioned fine under Anakin Skywalker's lead, and he clearly cared about his clones' lives as well. But when someone like Krell took over and began sending the 501st into suicidal missions, the clones not only openly questioned him, but eventually even went against his orders and eventually carried out a mutiny against them and executed him. Which turned out to be the right thing to do because Krell was secretly working for Count Dooku. Now finally, months before the rise of the New Order and the downsizing of the Jedi Order, a clone trooper by the name of Tups murdered a Jedi general in the middle of a battle. It turned out that all clones were implanted with the behavioral control chip, and Tups' chip had malfunctioned. When his fellow trooper Fives found out about this chip, it further created distrust amongst the clones and their leaders. Although Fives was never able to spread the information about the chip to all the clones, some troopers like Rex did listen to him and eventually would free themselves of these chips. Now, it's oftentimes said that the Emperor had various reasons why he phased out the clones, like cost, production time, or genetic vulnerability. But the clones were definitely individuals. They weren't really these mindless killing machines that the Kaminoans wanted them to be. Which just goes to show you can't have something that's creative and intelligent, but at the same time not have them be individualistic and have their own thoughts. One does not come without the other. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button. Thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.